Hello, so we'll be starting in just a minute as we admit attendees into this session. So please bear with us as we wait for people to file in electronically from the waiting room into the session here. As people are filing in from the waiting room into our webinar this afternoon, I'd like to be sure that you know that this event will be recorded and publicly circulated. So it will be available after the session as a video that you can share with others and view later on. Now, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's event. My name is Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences here at the University of California at Irvine, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on racial violence and restorative engagement in a time of pandemic. Just a word of contextualization about why we decided to host this event. First, there are obvious disparities in the way that the pandemic is impacting various communities in our country and around the world. And we thought that we needed to take an occasion to have a conversation about those and continue those conversations as the pandemic unfolds. But second, on March 31st at UC Irvine, we held a forum on the US Census. It was the day before Census Day, and we wanted to raise awareness about the importance of the census to our various communities. And that event was Zoom bombed. That was, for many of us, our first introduction to Zoom bombing, and for some of us, the first time we even heard the word. Our event was attacked by racist, misogynist, and anti-Semitic violence. Folks jumped in and began posting things and commenting and trying to take it over. Our very capable tech team very quickly shut it down, but we didn't want to let that just pass. We did end up redoing the event with a much smaller audience, and we made it available for others to view. But what occurred with our event is part of a broader pattern, particularly targeting racial and ethnic minorities and events where women of color are offering their perspectives on the pandemic and other matters besides. And our panel was almost exclusively made up of women of color. We want to note that this kind of violence and intimidation and extremism is not new, even if the technology is new. And I also want to say, it's not just bored kids. I think we're hearing a lot now that, oh, you know, there's bored kids at home who are causing trouble. It's not just bored kids. This stuff is targeted and it's meant to intimidate. And so here we are for a conversation about racial violence and restorative engagement in this context of the pandemic. I'll introduce our panelists and moderator and then hand it off to the moderator for the conversation that will follow. We have 5 fabulous panelists. Karin Gustafson is the director of the Center on Law, Equality, and Race and Associate Dean of Academic Community Engagement at the UCI School of Law. Her research and scholarship is interdisciplinary and explores the role of law in remedying inequality and also in reinforcing inequality. Sora Tanjasiri is professor of epidemiology and associate director of cancer health disparities and community engagement at the Chow Family Comprehensive Cancer Center at Irvine. Her research focuses on addressing cancer health disparities among diverse populations, particularly Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. She also serves as advisor to numerous nonprofits, such as the Orange County Asian Pacific Islander Community Alliance, the Orange County Women's Health Project, and California Dialogue on Cancer. Roderick Crooks is assistant professor in the Department of Informatics in the Donald Bren School of Information and Computer Sciences at UC Irvine. He studies how digital technology is used by minoritized communities and the civic institutions that serve them. His recent work concerns education technology, surveillance, and digitally mediated forms of activism. Allison Edwards is Chief Executive Officer of the nonprofit organization OC Human Relations. OC Human Relations has been bringing together diverse people to work on critical human relations issues for almost 30 years. The agency provides training and education programs in collaboration with schools, communities, and other organizations to create an Orange County where all people feel safe, valued, and included. The organization also partners with the County of Orange to track and report hate crime in Orange County. Debbie Lacey is the founder and CEO of Eastside for All in East King County, Washington. And it's sort of weird in a Zoom context to welcome Debbie to Irvine, even though we're all like in this digitally distributed space. But thank you so much for joining us, Debbie. She co-founded the Eastside Refugee and Immigrant Coalition there and joins us from Kirkland, Washington today. She has over 20 years experience in nonprofit leadership, group facilitation, intercultural competency, and coalition building. She helped bring the welcoming movement to her community and is building the first race and social justice advocacy organization in East King County to address local systemic inequities. They will be moderated today by Doug Haynes. And Doug Haynes is our Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of California at Irvine. He directs the Office of Inclusive Excellence and the UCI Advanced Program, and he's also a professor in the Department of History. As a historian, he studies modern Europe and is particularly interested in the relationship between medicine and science and imperialism. With that, again, I'd like to welcome you all for being here this afternoon, and I will hand it over to Professor Haynes. Doug.
Afternoon webinar. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of Professor Judy Wu, the director of the Humanities Center, in conceiving of this webinar shortly after that Zoom bombing incident. The first segment of the webinar will be a panel discussion, and that'll be followed by panelist responses to audience questions. And so let's get started. The first question I want to ask revolves essentially around the tension between the enduring challenges and opportunities of diversity and the social justice realities of the unprecedented pandemic known as COVID-19. And so, Karin, I want to ask you, to what extent has the pandemic, including responses and reactions, exacerbated or even created new conditions or realities for bias, prejudice, or bigotry?
I think the pandemic has brought to the surface both long-standing racial and ethnic inequalities and persistent strains of racial anxiety and racial animosity, right? And we can see the racial anxiety in examples of people blaming Asians for bringing coronavirus to the United States, right? It's a virus, it moves without human will. And you know, the Zoom bombing is clearly an example of that racial animosity, but it's always been there. And at a time when our interdependence on each other and our universal vulnerability could serve as something to highlight at this moment, what we're seeing is that the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic fractures that already existed in society are sort of breaking open.
Thank you. Karin, I want to turn to Allison Edwards because of her role with the Human Relations Commission. That's a nonprofit. And each year they produce a hate crime report. And Allison, I'd like to know, how would you describe the climate now in this early part of 2020?
So we are definitely seeing an increase in hate crime and hate incident as it relates to COVID-19. And there are different organizations actually across the nation that are trying to track specifically hate behavior related to this, and most often directed at AAPI communities and Jewish communities. And I think nationwide, it's up into the thousands. In LA, the StopAPI tracker has, as of last week, over 1,400 reports. Our numbers are lower in Orange County, but I'm convinced we're definitely not getting all the stories to our to our agency, to our website. And the truth is that a lot of times the way we collect hate crime and hate incident information is about waiting till the end of the calendar year and having all the organizations that get reports, then we help aggregate that data. So we know we're not getting all of it, but we have had in the past, 2018 is the most recent report that's out, and that has about 3% of hate activity where the Asian American community is targeted. And it's not an exact comparison, but if we look at what we've documented so far that has been attributed to COVID for 2020, it's 60% of the reports we have around hate activity are related to COVID. So again, it's not an exact comparison, but you can see even with that inability, it's a huge increase. So that's definitely on our radar. And I think we see this overall opportunistic moment for hate and extremism to use our social and physical distancing as a way to really play upon fear and suspicion. And I mean, that unfortunately, that's sort of an age-old tactic, but we see it again because we're seeing different ways that just the white supremacist movement is trying to insert into this moment as well.
You know, one area that has struck me about the reporting on the pandemic not only focuses on issues around hate and bias and bigotry, but also in terms of disparities in reference to healthcare. And so I want to turn to Sora at this moment. And could you sort of comment on the degree to which the pandemic has aggravated existing disparities and in turn is shaping who's getting access to testing and treatment? And tell us more about some of the communities that are affected.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, it's no stretch to know that the pandemic and particularly social isolation is privileging certain communities over others. So those, of course, who can successfully socially isolate are those with, access to health care and health insurance, so testing and treatment costs, those with access to stable housing and clean water, healthy foods, healthy environments, jobs that allow them to telecommute, and trusted doctors that they can even communicate with in terms of information. Health disparities oftentimes falls along racial, ethnic, geographic, sexual orientation, homelessness populations, and these are all the populations that we are very concerned about being at either higher risk for exposures and or higher risk for in terms of not being able to socially isolate. For example, they're in essential job areas like construction or healthcare, et cetera. If you look at the pandemic numbers in California, now it's hard to take a look at the disparities, for instance, new cases because we just don't have enough testing, but the data around deaths is actually suggesting, and again, we don't know quite yet, we're gonna have to monitor this, high proportion of deaths among African Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders compared to their proportion in the population. And when you turn those into rates, they're actually fairly alarming. And so we really need to take a look at what are the underlying either social conditions or health conditions that are putting those populations at risk. I also want to point out that, lack of access to even basic health information is differential across our populations. And so while those of us who can speak English fluently have access to the latest information, podcasts, live feeds, et cetera, it's really difficult for our more monolingual populations. And in particular, I'm talking about our immigrant populations. So, large populations of Vietnamese, Spanish-speaking, Southeast Asian, Hmong, et cetera. I will say that while the pandemic is the big issue, we are looking at also enduring impacts over time. We know from research that's gone on in other kind of historically, nationally traumatic events, for example, post 9/11, that there are enduring mental health, stress, anxiety, and risk behaviors that are differentially conferred among populations. So while everyone in past studies have found higher rates of physical ailments and healthcare utilization, those will translate into greater morbidity and mortality among the populations that don't have access currently to our health and our public health infrastructure.
So you not only have the underserved, but you also have the long-term impact of the trauma as well. Lucy, does this resonate with you given your sort of leadership in East King County? Working with immigrants and refugees?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. Debbie Lacey. I do see that the same things that you all are mentioning, we're seeing here. We have a community where 1 out of 3 of our residents are immigrants and refugees, and we're seeing great linguistic justice issues right now and disparities in people being able to get the information they need to make safe choices, to access benefits and resources, including healthcare. We are starting to see numbers, early data coming in that is alarming us as to who is getting diagnosed. And then, even that issue of data collection and tracking is itself an advocacy issue, because that hasn't been done with great forethought or consistency across the country. So we're behind already in being able to have accurate data to reflect the disparities that are happening. So yes, our community is one where I think similar to yours there in Orange County, where we have a great racial wealth gap. And we know that there's huge gaps in our community when it comes to healthcare access and then ability to advocate for oneself around workers' rights. We have had lots of issues pertaining to labor issues so that people working who have to work are able to be protected and kept safe and able to take the sick leave required to take care of themselves and their families. So I think what we're seeing is the multiple layers of and all the ways in which our community safety nets have either been strong all along or in most cases very weak. And it just becomes all the more glaring when we have this kind of crisis in front of us.
Ricky, one of the ironies about the present situation, I would imagine, both in Orange County and King County, is the sort of the digital space. And so we're brought together in part because of this very traumatic incident that took place more than a week ago. And it raises a question, and I want to direct this to you, Roderick. What is the peril and what is the safety that digital spaces presents or afford people today? Is there any safety in digital spaces, or does it really reinforce the digital divide?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Also, thanks for having me here. So I study specifically access to technology in minoritized communities, and most of my work has taken place here in Greater Los Angeles, in minoritized communities in South LA, in Black and Latinx communities there. And so one thing I came here to say was about access. So kind of following on what the earlier speakers say, I actually don't think we should view access as a binary opposition, as kind of having access or not having access. Really, we want to think about access as a particular configuration, and that configuration is always going to come with benefits and costs. So when we look at access, I don't want to say who has access and who doesn't. I want to say who has access, at what cost, and who pays for it. Mm-hmm. And so inequality is really the ground that the figure of access is standing on in the first place. Mm-hmm. So shorter answer, no, or maybe.
Thank you for the brevity, but I appreciate the context you sketched out. I want to ask a second question that sort of draws on the sort of the landscape that each of you have helped sort of sketch out, that sort of identifies the spike in intolerance, that it's a combination of change and continuity, as well as a sort of the endurance of disparities of healthcare, as well as to the digital spaces. And my question has to do to what extent, and I want to go to you first, Allison, does the pandemic create opportunities for greater engagement among different communities and populations? In other words, does it create more hurdles or opportunities for inter-community communication, cooperation, or for that matter, collaboration?
Well, I've also been at home for a month and in my case, almost entirely at home. So I'm going to try to mix my, I guess, experience with maybe I don't know everything that's going on in the world, but we see, some incredible acts of kindness and caring, and you all have probably seen those stories, and they're pretty well publicized, and those are appreciated. I see even beyond the digital divide, I think people are finding ways to connect with their support systems, with their, whether that be family, friends, whomever. I think sometimes we assume that has to happen now via Zoom, but there are still telephones in the world, and people can still reach out. I have a longer term concern though, if we are connecting beyond our people, you know, whoever that is in your life that you're like, yeah, those are my people, because we have really taken away most of any incidental contact we have with people outside of our kind of inner circles. And so when I think short term, I think there are some exceptional moments, and maybe they're actually not all that exceptional. People are, I think, giving a lot of grace. They're trying to be very generous. They're checking in on neighbors that maybe they didn't know before. But I think long term, what will be the consequence of our social ties beyond that? What about all the people from different backgrounds, from different communities that we do interact with day to day in our quote unquote normal lives or prior to this? There's some great research looking at the 1918 flu pandemic that some of you may have seen, that talked about some communities felt like they never returned back to that sense they originally had. Said people didn't host parties anymore. They didn't come by for a visit. But in the communities where the leadership was thought of as strong and transparent, particularly where the communities were well informed, I think it was a buffer against conspiracy theories and blaming and suspicion, and there was less room for those negative aspects of this time to find life. And so it's both right now, but I see concern for the long term. What are we going to do collectively to make sure that we rebuild those social ties that we're not accessing in this moment?
And Radha, what do you think about that? In some sense, is the current way in which people are engaging with each other, is it creating new possibilities for community building, or is it sustainable for the future once we get through this crisis?
Well, that's pretty difficult. I don't want to kind of overgeneralize, and I also don't want to over prioritize kind of questions of technology and determining social relations, but it's generally true that many benefits that accumulate to digital technology. So benefits that we're talking about here is maybe educational benefits, benefits to citizenship, benefits to political participation. Those tend to also be distributed quite unevenly.
Yeah.
So whoever is better positioned to benefit from such benefits in the first place is more likely to reap them.
And Debbie, does that sort of echo with your experience in King County, that in some sense, these kind of baked in hurdles not only affect who participates, but also who benefits from it?
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to engagement, one of the things I wanted to name is that times like this tend to fuel activism. We saw this after 9/11 when there was a lot of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment. People really spoke up out against that, and people came together in ways they hadn't before to protect their fellow neighbors. We saw that, of course, at the end of 2016, and we're seeing that now. People are standing up for communities that are being disproportionately impacted, for the longer term effects that we're already starting to fear and see. So I think that there's an opportunity here for engagement when it comes to activism, advocacy at the local level. And I really would encourage people to take whatever passion they're feeling, frustration, fear, concern for their fellow community members, and channel that into some local advocacy groups and others that are doing this work on the ground to connect people around those important issues where there's a sense of urgency and crisis right now that will only serve us not only in the short term, of course, but in the long term as we continue to build relationships across movements and across different groups in our community.
You know, and I want to take that thread that you just articulated, Debbie, and ask Karin, how do we equip ourselves in this unique context to advance a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because it does involve another burden, extra work, usually for the same folks.
Yeah. But it is a moment of opportunity. And, you know, so we might think about last week's Zoom bombing as spectacular violence, right? As spectacular racial violence. It's visible, it's painful for the moment, but there's been slow violence going on for a long time, right? Rob Nixon, who writes about environmental degradation, has written about slow violence. And we're seeing the effects of slow violence in this country, right? Material inequality, racial inequality playing out in who is dying in this pandemic in the United States, right? We are seeing Black communities and Native communities ravaged with high rates of premature death. It's easy to disengage, but this is the time when we need to lean in and think about what we can do, because this moment of disruption is also a moment when we can reimagine what our communities and what our society will look like after the pandemic. We can, you know, think about what we want our government to do for us. We can think about, and the, I think one of the starkest realities here is it's the caretakers in the United States who are being lost in the pandemic, right? From the medical workers to the people we interact with on the street every day whose names we don't know, the bus drivers, the Uber drivers, the Lyft drivers. And I think we can reaffirm our commitment to those who are at the margins of society.
You know, with that, the importance of community building and advocacy is so important. And I want to turn to the third question, and I want to invite you to kick us off in responding, Sora. Each of us are situated in different organizations. Several of us work at UC Irvine, others work for nonprofits, either in Orange County or in King County. And my question is, what have we learned from the Zoom bombing incident? And two, what can we do as organizations, as levers of change?
Sorry to be so pithy, but the first question, what have we learned? We've learned to use Zoom more carefully because discussions like these need to be safe, they need to be robust, they must be inclusive. I think the important thing that I always do in my work is to remember that we're talking about communities and populations that just don't have deficits, but they have a lot of assets. I mean, I have the pleasure of working with Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. You know, makes up 20% of the population in Orange County. We have over 600,000 Asian American and Pacific Islanders. We're the third and the fifth largest Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in the nation. You know, we've got the third largest number of small businesses that contribute $20 billion to the local economy. This is a tremendous amount of asset. And I think what we are learning, as I call out to all of our partners in the cancer world, but their social service agencies, their faith groups, their cultural groups, is that they're all connected to their communities, and they are pivoting, as we all are, right, from providing maybe navigation around cancer needs to providing basic needs, you know, bags of rice and hand sanitizers, real basic needs, but they've still got all of those connections. So I think what we can learn is that those basic structures are out there. And as a good neighbor, as a large, you know, comprehensive and research university, it is our duty to reach out, to continue to connect and to be able to support. You know, our charge of doing education is still important. And I for all of us, I'm sure, and I'm sure for the many students who are on this call, you know, it is challenging. But my first question always to the students is, how are you and how are your families? What are you doing to educate them? You are seen, many of you are first in your family to go to school. You are seen as access to expertise, or as these emerging public health and other experts. Serve that role. You know you want to serve that role, and help the university to be responsive to the structures and the strengths that are already in communities. Because we're so fragmented, our usual ways of doing this, right, in lectures or in symposia or going out and doing trainings, are no longer possible. But our students and our communities have all these connections. They're still out there. I've got great hope in that we can uncover some of these newer and underlying social connections and pathways, and learn more about how the university can be helpful to strengthen and support them in times of need and beyond.
Allison, I want to ask you, because you're leading a major non-for-profit in Orange County. Sora just described the role of the university. What about other nonprofits, and to what extent, what have they learned, and to what extent, what can they do during this moment of crisis?
Well, that answer, I think, is going to vary greatly. We've seen, obviously, those who are providing basic need respond quickly. I think the learning there has probably been even more for the funders, and how to pivot quickly to make funds available, and how to renegotiate their dollars, and how they can be spent. For many of us, it's figuring out, how does our expertise contribute in this moment? So rather than changing what we do or trying to jump on to a whole different mission, it's really, how can we contribute from our area of expertise? So for our organization, we are experts in all of our work is face-to-face. Facilitation, mediation, restorative practices, but we quickly tried to figure out how we can do that online. We quickly tried to figure out how we could turn some of these campaigns into online campaigns. So in a very practical way, we're calling on people to fight hate from home. So we have a campaign right now called No Hate, and we created a No Hate challenge, and it's a door decorating activity. Decorate your door or your window with the reasons that you fight hate, post it online, tell us why you fight hate, throw a hashtag on there. But I think there's, for many of us, there's like this tension of, what do we do right in this moment to be responsive, to show communities we're with them, to continue to set the community standard that we're not gonna tolerate hate, racism. And then there's this longer term trajectory about how do we address these disparities that have, that were known to us, but are particularly, unveiled, I guess, in this process. And I got to be honest with you, we're sort of answering that question as we go. How can we be, contributors to that? It is a huge question. It's definitely part of our work, but I think we have to be in spaces and places like this, partnering with universities and other partners to see how we can do that effectively and be good partners.
Debbie, for Eastside for All in East King County, to what extent has your organization changed as a result of the pandemic? It could be as basic as moving activities from in-person to online, and as Allison referred to, modifying how to reset your budget, and at the same time, serving your constituencies. It sounds like a high wire act.
Well, it always is for nonprofits, as everyone on the panel probably knows. And I think for us, our organization is fairly new. I've been working in our community for a long time, but Eastside for All just formed at the end of 2019. So we feel like we're drinking from the water hose. And what we're doing is we're assessing what are the community needs, and then what are we uniquely positioned to address, and what do we have the capacity and skill to address right now, this year, and that will have the most impact on our mission. So I think that all organizations that we work with, certainly in our coalition and network, are asking those same tough questions, and let's make sure that we're naming also that part of the economic crisis we're in right now is impacting our nonprofits. There are many that won't be able to survive. And so we have to think about that when we're talking about ways to connect with community members who are particularly vulnerable. Who is going to be providing them with the information and resources they need if we're 3, 6 to 9 months out from here and our nonprofits aren't able to stay open? I mean, that's a dire picture that I'm painting, but it is a reality, and many of my nonprofit partners are extremely concerned about that right now.
Yeah, it's difficult to bootstrap when you have no boots. I want to turn to Karen and Roderick. First, you, Karen, to sort of consider to what extent how UCI will be different and the ways in which what we learn from this incident can help inform how the university changes.
Well, I think universities around the country are going to be changing in the next year or two, simply because resources and resource allocations will be changing. That a lot of institutions will be shifting their focus, and my guess is we will see more funding flowing into medical research and science, and probably less flowing into areas like the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, what the uneven effects of COVID are showing us that this isn't just a medical problem in the United States, it's a social problem, it's a problem of unequal access. And so we need to be sure that resources and research are continuing in all of the areas where universities are strong. I think we will also see a lot of families where it's more difficult for students to move into higher education. That priorities within communities and families will shift. And so we will need to make sure that opportunities are available to keep the pipeline open for those people who've had trouble accessing university educations in the past.
Mm-hmm. And Roderick, how you sort of envision what we've learned from the Zoom bombing instance and others like it, and how that should shape how the university changes. And as Karen mentioned, hopefully that can mean paying more attention to disparities, ensuring students do participate. And I would just add, being proactive about promoting an inclusive culture. Because as we've learned, you can have bad actors from different platforms.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking primarily along 2 lines for the future, but one of them sort of has to do with the art of teaching and how you might use tools, online tools in particular, to do authentic and effective teaching. So there's already a lot of research, particularly from my colleagues at the Connected Learning Lab, which is led by Professor Mimi Ito, which say that it's very difficult, very laborious. It takes a lot of resources to produce an authentic online learning experience. So if online learning is in our future, I hope we could maybe attend to the research in that area that has already happened. And then the other thing I guess I hope for the future, if this is an opportunity, I hope it's an opportunity for the university to check in with our community. So do our students have enough to eat? Our students, do they have somewhere to live? Do their families have enough to eat? Do their families have somewhere to live? And are they going to be able to come up with the resources that they need in order to engage in learning? So I think there's probably a lot more we could do locally, but I think we first have to begin by checking in here and saying, what are the needs here and what can we do to meet them? And then I guess I said 2 things, but a third is, I also am fearful that this would be an opportunity for the university to kind of withdraw from its commitments to diversity and inclusion. And so I don't know how we might avoid that, except to just say right at the outset that we don't want recovery and we don't want the future of the university to be bought at that price. So to be paid for by people who would then no longer be included.
I want to thank each of you for sharing your perspectives on those three questions. As you were sort of commenting, I was reminded of a very powerful statement by Martin Luther King in 1964. And I think it's a timely statement wherein he noted that we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I think many of the comments during the first segment highlighted the fact that the actions that took place last week were designed to affect a lot of people based on their race and ethnicity, their religious affiliation. And I think it's a reminder that events like this are particularly powerful in both reminding people that there is a community organized around inclusion, equity, and diversity. Second, that it's imperative that we raise awareness about intolerance. I think that's key to the work of the OC Human Relations Commission. It's key to the East Side for All. I think it's key to many of the programs and offices that are connected to UCI. I would further add something else that we need to recognize and bridge these obvious disparities that have been indicated in healthcare, but also other spaces as well. And I just want to echo something that Roderick mentioned, that now is the time for organizations, non-for-profits, to emphatically invest and support this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion that take many forms that affect and relate to our students who are here today, but also future students, as well as our employees and the many people that we serve throughout Orange County and wider Southern California. There's two things I want to leave the audience with before we turn to their questions. And first, there's two resources. One is I put out a statement entitled Inclusivity in Difficult Times in February that really sort of talked about the need to change how we talk about the COVID-19 and to call out the sort of racist representations of China and Chinese people that this pandemic has enabled. The second resource that I want to draw your attention to is a new research call that we just launched for our faculty entitled, Are We in This Together? Advancing Equity in the Age of COVID. And I think the goal of that call is to mobilize faculty research to really bear witness to the persistent inequities that really bisect our society. So with that, I'd like to turn to Sora and ask her to share what question that she wants to comment on.
All right, so I see one question around advocacy and what can scholar citizens or students and other advocates do. So I think that it's very urgent that in the short run that we definitely contact our elected officials. We need to urge them to reduce the racist rhetoric that's going on and to increase the message of unity, collaboration, and collectivism. We're all in this together. Public health, we are only as healthy as our most vulnerable. And the pandemic shows those gaps in our services. I think longer term, I think it's very important to two things: educate our communities about the importance of completing the census. We need 100% participation in the complete count. So please, for anyone, if you haven't already, go and fill out your census and make sure that your family members do, or your friends, etc. And I think that we also need as many thoughtful, proactive, caring people from across the party lines, whatever party you're from, to register and to vote. Get involved in local, state, and national elections, whether it's on topics and funding issues or whether it's for candidates, because we need to increase the proactiveness of our future elected officials. I will say one more thing, because I do see a question around what information is available for people of color, and I talked about this being a difficulty. So I do want to point out that the Orange County Healthcare Agency has several in-language materials at their website. LA County is doing a really good job of doing daily calls, I think at 1 o'clock in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean, I think it is. And the California Endowment, if you want to go to their website, they are pushing out a huge COVID-19 response and supporting communities to educate others about this in language. So those are just 3 websites. I'll try and post them very quickly in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. Allison?
I actually think Karin was going to answer the next question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So there was a question about federal policies and what people could do to get involved with government decision making. And I think that it's important for people to stay aware of what's happening both in state, federal, and local policy making. And there are a number of things right now that are making healthcare access and avoidance of COVID-19 particularly hard for particular communities. For example, the recent public charge rule for immigrants means that green card holders are deterred from seeking medical help because the public charge rule provides that use of public benefits will jeopardize somebody's green card status or ability to obtain a green card, right? That's a problem. There's a proposal right now to reduce the wages of farm workers at this very moment when food production and food access is being disrupted. We need to make sure that the people picking our food, the people producing our food are safe and healthy so that we have a safe and healthy food supply. There was a piece in the Washington Post this morning about particulate levels in air pollution, and how while the scientists at the EPA have recommended stricter controls on particulate matter and soot, and that these pollution levels are one of the contributing factors to racially disparate effects on communities of color. The EPA is recommending that we leave the pollution controls where they are. People can speak up. People can contact their representatives in Congress, their senators, and make clear that we need everybody to be healthy, right? Everybody plays a role in the supply chains. Every vulnerable person proves to be a risk to everyone else.
Well, are there further comments from the panel? I want to thank you all again. Oh, I'm sorry, Debbie.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on something that Karin was saying. The United States Citizen and Immigration Services put out a statement in mid-March. I just wanted to have people maybe check that out, because we're understanding that it would not be used against immigrants if they were to seek health care related to the COVID crisis. That wouldn't be relevant to the public charge new rules. So we do want to make sure that we're verifying that. But I just wanted to make sure that that was put out there, because I think that that is a huge worry and concern for many of our immigrant community members.
I just want to say thank you, Debbie, for mentioning that. We were already hearing from our community clinics that public charge was reducing the number of even preventive healthcare services that populations, those who were here, legally, obviously, right? They were seeking citizenship, were reducing their preventive care. I cannot stress enough how important it is, especially in COVID-19, to get the message out there, to encourage everyone to seek healthcare if they suspect, right, any kind of exposure or infection. I think a lot of advocacy is going to go into ensuring that people on the back end after treatment don't get hit with medical charges, right, that will put them into severe economic situations. And I do want to add then that while this is very long term, we need to, in this country, unlink health insurance coverage from jobs, because we can see the exact crack happening now where tens of millions of people are losing their jobs and they're losing their health insurance. And so we're all fearful about the wave of medical care costs that's going to come to these are very vulnerable. And this is everyone. This doesn't just affect people by ethnic, racial, or geographic lines. This affects everyone. So that's a plug for some sort of health insurance for all.
Alvin?
Sure. I just wanted to make sure that, I get the opportunity to just ask folks that if you are hearing of more hate activity going on in Orange County, that it's really important to report that. You can report that to us directly. If you don't want to report that to a law enforcement agency, you can let us know. You can actually file those reports online. I'll make sure to include our website in the chat. But that's the main way that we can make sure that these stories are told, that they are lifted up into the consciousness of the county. We need people to know that this is happening, and we want to make sure that we can document stories. And I'll give you some examples. Is sometimes people don't even realize that things that they can report to us. For example, I was on a call with some other panelists last week, and they were sharing how their children, when school was still in, were being asked, should you be here? Or you're spreading the virus, and things like this. So that may not be a crime, and we would not document it as a hate crime, but that is hate motivated behavior. We call them hate incidents. And those are things that we want to make sure that don't go untold. It's important for us to know what's happening in our community. Hate crime and hate incident are grossly underreported. So I just want to encourage folks that if this is happening to you, not only to report it, but we can get you support services. And if you see this happening online, you can just take a screenshot. You can upload that on our website. So please, if this is happening, please let us know. We're here to support you and stand with you.
Thank you. Debbie.
Thanks for that, Allison, too. I think just when it comes to these, how do we mitigate the impacts on people of color, whether it's with the healthcare, economic, socially, I really want to stress that while it's so important that we address those individual acts of hate, and I'm so fortunate that we've had an outcry about that, we have lots of people supporting that. If we don't also actively address the institutional and structural forms of racism that continue to perpetuate and exacerbate the situations that we're in, that we find ourselves all in all the time, the violence on all forms, not just interpersonal, we will come to this place again and again. So in addition to encouraging people to stand up for their neighbors and other community members against hate, I would really encourage people to form those larger form and join those larger movements that are undergoing extreme transformation right now in the midst of all of this, and really see that as a place where you can contribute and have a great impact on making lasting change and systemic change.
Panelists, we have about 1 more minute for comments and reflections on questions. Do I see any hands? Roderick.
Sure. I just wanted to echo Debbie's point. That kind of takes us back to where we started the conversation. But in that respect, the contemporary, the current pandemic is really showing us that these struggles of people for food, for education, for community control of technology are ongoing and have been continuous for decades. So those needs still are addressing, and those demands that people in struggle have made for decades are still very much alive.
Thank you. On that note, what I'd like to do is to hand off to Dean Maurer, who will provide some closing remarks. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone for their participation and perspectives. Bill?
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you again to all of our panelists, Karen, Debbie, Roderick, Allison, Sora. Thank you so much for sharing with us and helping us think through these issues. I think that it's an important point to remember that this isn't just, let's have this conversation and then we're done. This is an ongoing thing. It has a long history. It will have a long afterlife, and we need to keep these conversations going, keep our commitment alive, and keep diversity and inclusion at the forefront of what we're doing in our work, in the university, in the nonprofits that we're connected with, in our political lives, and in the very simple basic act, as Sora said, of just going to that census website and filling out that form. So I really want to thank the panelists for what I hope is not the last of our Zoom forums here, because I'm sure we'll be in this space for some time to come. And then again, for what will happen when we come out of it, as we do slowly and in stages end our social distancing and think about rebuilding our social fabric in a more robust and inclusive way. I also just want to give a special thank you to Judy Wu, who's here but invisible right now and in the chat. Thank you so much, Judy, for inspiring us to come together to put on this event and hold this conversation today, and for what I know you're going to be doing to organize us in the future. And also thank you very much to Amanda Swain, Joo-Hoon Sin, and Jenny Fan, who have also been here in the background, keeping us going, feeding our souls, and also managing some of the technology that is way beyond my own ken here. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, the UCI Humanities Center, the School of Social Sciences, the UCI Center on Law, Equality, and Race, the Office of Inclusive Excellence, and all of the other organizations that we've listed on our event website. Again, this has been recorded and will be available on the UCI Humanities Center website at some point after we conclude this afternoon. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions before and during the event, and for your participation in this session today. Please, everyone, stay safe. Continue practicing social distancing to the extent that you're able. And let's remember those who are really doing the essential work that needs to get done as we weather this pandemic. Thank you all very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.